Hello everyone on YouTube! Welcome to the very first video of 2024. Happy belated New Year! Well, I was going to say Happy New Year, but for some of us it might not be a Happy New Year, particularly for those using the Mate desktop, depending on the distribution. And that answers the question, is Mate in a deprecated state? Well, we're going to find out. So, the Mate desktop. What is Mate? Mate is a fork of GNOME 2. In fact, it's designed to be that way. Once GNOME released version 3, a lot of the Linux community decided they didn't like GNOME, so they ended up switching desktops, and Mate was formed from that. And Mate is true to its word, a true replacement for the classic GNOME 2. It's got a nice panel at the where all your important stuff is. It's got an applications menu by pressing F1. It's fully accessible with the Orca screen reader, and that makes it a soft spot for the visually impaired. And one of the distributions I wanted to install at some point this year has only gone and released version 4.5 of the distribution and are ditching the Mate desktop and are replacing it with the less accessible XFCE desktop. And let me tell you one thing, I do like XFCE, but I don't recommend it for most people. It's not fully accessible. It's getting there. I mean, MX Linux, I've been working with them on making their spin accessible. And I think Slint is also thinking of using XFCE. I'm not entirely sure. Dev1 uses XFCE, but most people could just use the network install and install whatever distribution they want. But this is pretty. I don't like this one bit. Many visually impaired people will no longer be able to use Solus pretty soon, as they're ditching the Mate desktop. And on top of that, they'll be looking at switching those users to either GNOME, KDE, Budgie, or XFCE. And let me tell you one thing, neither of which are accessible. GNOME, well, you'd think GNOME was accessible, but no, it's not. It doesn't work that well with Orca. Orca does read some of the GNOME user interface, but here's what happens. When you press the super key, aka the Windows key, on the GNOME desktop, Orca says window. An advanced user would know to type into the search box, you're actually placed in the activities overview on a stock GNOME desktop. But most people, but you don't know that because Orca didn't tell you. And I don't blame Orca one bit. I think Orca is a great screen reader. I blame the GNOME desktop developers. Because ever since GNOME 3, the whole desktop was redesigned. And Orca was made with GNOME 2 in mind. And KDE? Well, only recently has KDE actually started working on accessibility support. It's nowhere near properly done yet. We should have to wait. We'll wait until Plasma 6 comes out, which I'm pretty sure is coming out very, very soon. So I'm looking forward to seeing that, even though I'm not really a Plasma fan, but I'm interested in KDE. Budgie is based on GNOME, so same accessibility issues as GNOME. And the Budgie developers have even turned around and said, we don't recommend people try out Budgie from Solus. And they're recommending Ubuntu Budgie instead, which is pretty interesting. Ubuntu Budgie, I think most of the Budgie development is coming from that now instead, as well as the upstream communities that support the desktop environment. It's not about desktop for those who want to use it. Neither of those desktops are bad, it's just that the choices that Solus have made, well, not really good. And I would argue that it's not Mate that's in a deprecated state, it's Solus. Because since 2022, there have been power cuts, server failures, repos going out of sync. We've had Ike Doherty leaving the project, and then the successor leaving. They've only recently gained traction again, but I don't know how long this is going to last. Many of the people I've spoken to who used Linux, well, who are thinking of using Linux, and who want a rolling release, I've recommended Solus, and they've loved it. I mean, I had someone ask me if Solus is any good, and I recommended it. I loved it back then, and I've only recently found out how to make Google Chrome and all of its other Chromium counterparts accessible on not just Solus, but on other distributions that don't come with an accessibility environment variable by default. And it's pretty easy to do. If you want a video on that, then let me know in the comments, because it's a pretty easy thing to do. Or I can just simply reply to any comment that asks it, and it's pretty easy to do. I don't need to do a video on that if you don't want me to, because yeah, it's pretty easy to do. So, what about Mate? Is it in a deprecated state? No, it's not. And the reason why Solus is saying it is because Mate will never get Wayland support. And that's absolutely not true. If you go onto the Mate development on their GitHub, you're going to find that they're working on Wayland support, and they're using something called Wavefire. And I reckon that in Mate 1.28, which will probably release in August of this year, or maybe even July, we'll get something pretty close to Wayland, or maybe even full Wayland support. Because Mate is very capable of Wayland. It's got GTK elements, and GTK is fully compatible with Wayland. All the other desktops that Solus is using is Wayland compatible, except for Mate. And that's why they're replacing it with XFCE, which, quite frankly, is a massive shame. And let me ask you this. If I was running the distribution, would I ditch Mate simply because it wasn't Wayland compatible? And the answer to that is no, I wouldn't. And the reason is because if I would have users who need Mate because it's an accessibility requirement. The only screen reader out there for Linux, well, the only graphical screen reader out there for Linux, should I say, only works with that desktop. I wouldn't just ditch Mate simply because of Wayland support and force those existing users to switch to Budgie, GNOME, or KDE. I would look at other distributions and see what they're doing with their Mate desktop. And other distributions are not ditching Mate anytime soon. Let's take a look at them. Debian. Debian knowingly supports accessibility. It's in their official documentation. The current project leader is visually impaired, so that also makes sense. Another distribution based on Debian is Dev1. And yeah, Dev1 is accessible too. And they're also supporting it as well. And they both support the Mate desktop. They're officially supported desktop environments. You can choose to install those during the installation, or in the case of Debian, you can install a live image configured with Mate desktop. On Dev1 though, I recommend using the net installer, because the default live image is XFCE, but most visually impaired Dev1 users aren't going to be doing that, aren't going to be needing Dev1. And Slint, a distribution based on Slackware, nope, they're not ditching Mate anytime soon. They wouldn't want to anyway. Mate is the only accessible desktop out there at the moment, at the time of this video. Ubuntu, well, no. Ubuntu will not ditch the Mate desktop. In fact, Ubuntu wants to make Linux more accessible. Just look at what they're doing with the latest installer. I mean, they've released a new installer, which I'm looking forward to checking out in 2 months' time with Ubuntu 24.04. And that installer is focusing big time on accessibility. They're going to try and do their best to make the distribution accessible so that official flavors can then switch to using that installer. And that includes the well-renowned Ubuntu Mate and Martin Wimpress is one of the lead developers of the Mate desktop. And I can't forget about Linux Mint. Clem, the main developer of Linux Mint, is actually involved with some of the Mate development. So Mate has plenty of people on its community that are maintaining the desktop and improving it. And Solus, well, now that they're ditching Mate for a non-accessible option, they've got two options. They either lose their visually impaired base, which is not ideal. I mean, next year there's going to be a big influx of Linux users due to Windows 10 going out of support. The majority of those are not the majority, but some of those are visually impaired. And they'll be forced, if they can't run Windows 11, they'll have to use Linux if they don't want to run Chrome OS Flex, for instance, if they need Linux. And Solus would be a recommendation. I used to recommend Solus a lot, but I don't think I can now. So what can I recommend to those who have previously recommended Solus? Well, I can only recommend Ubuntu Mate or Linux Mint. I'm very sorry, Fedora, but Fedora is just not... Fedora is alright. Fedora is alright for those users it was marketed to, but Fedora is not really meant for beginners. I'm pretty sure it isn't, because you have to configure RPM Fusion by default. But I think that's about to change soon. Developer, I'm pretty sure. Sorry if I can't say your name wrong. Wojtek Polisek is working on a distribution called Wojtux, and that's going to be based on Fedora. It'll use the Mate desktop. It'll focus primarily on accessibility, and it'll make all the accessible applications work. And it'll be based on stock Fedora. So that's one step in the right direction. Currently there are no ISO files yet. You'll have to build them yourself. I'm waiting for official ISO images to release so I can give the distribution a try. There's also my distribution, which I'm working on, called Salsa Linux, although I've suspended development on that distribution because we're getting a new version of Ubuntu pretty soon. And I'm thinking of changing the name to Espresso Linux, simply because it sounds better. And that distribution uses the Mate desktop. So those are all recommendations. Debian, Arch, Slint, and probably a few others, Trisquel included. I recommend those for people who know what they're doing with Linux. They've played with Ubuntu for a while, they've played with Mint for a while, they've played with Accessible Coconut for a while, and maybe they want to experiment. They want to see what other distributions are like and how Linux is structured. I would recommend something like Slint for them because it's based on Slackware, and Slackware is mainly for those who know what they're doing with Linux. Similar to Arch and Debian, although Debian is slowly becoming more user-friendly, especially now that we've got non-free firmware in the install images. But that doesn't answer the question. Or does it? Let's discuss further. My opinion on Mate and why I think it will continue to be a usable desktop for years to come. Mate is a very nice desktop. It's a very good desktop for those who want to use it. There are many distributions that are supporting it. The Mate official website actually recommends Solus on the list of distributions that support Mate and that offer a vanilla Mate. I mean, Solus does offer a vanilla Mate. The only thing they add is their homegrown Brisk menu, which has made it into other distributions, but to be fair, Brisk menu is probably one of the nicest Mate menu extensions I've ever seen. I mean, it was made by Solus themselves, and the Mate developers depend on Solus. All the distributions that support Mate have associations with the upstream project. Debian always sends patches to the upstream project, as well as Ubuntu and Mint and Arch and even some of the other less known distributions like Trisquel. In fact, while we're on the subject of Trisquel, compared to anything like GNOME, if you want a 100% fully free desktop environment, Mate is a brilliant choice. Trisquel's default image, the ISO file, is in fact Mate. In fact, I've got a Debian VM, I've got a Trisquel virtual machine set up on here. I'm currently booted into my Debian virtual machine though, so I can't go ahead and, I'm currently using that Debian VM, so I can't go ahead and shut it down now. But, what do you think? Let's start a discussion. Is Mate really deprecated? Or are the Solus devs just overreacting and being really mean to their users? I want to know your opinion about it in the comments and we'll start a discussion together. Because that's what being a Linux user is all about. Community contributions and creating your own creating your own community. It's going to rain soon. Thanks, rain alarm. And quite a lot of things. And I'm also planning on finally doing an up-to-date Arch Linux installation video. Although those who have watched my existing Arch Linux video, you can still install from that installation media. I mean, it still works. It's to some extent. So as I said, I want to know your opinion in the comments. What do you think about the Mate desktop? And do you think the decision of the decision Solus has made is fair? Bear in mind that there are visually impaired Solus users and that Solus packages Orca. They're packaging the Orca screen reader. So, to summarize my opinion, no. Mate is not deprecated. It's not in a dilapidated state at all. I think Solus actually is in a dilapidated state. It's been for quite a while. So saying Mate is in a dilapidated state, it's actually ruining the distribution. Because ever since Solus came on the scenes, they've provided patches to the Mate desktop. They've given us the excellent Brisk menu used in Ubuntu Mate. They've given us a few Mate dock applets, and quite frankly, Solus's implementation of Mate is probably one of the best Mate implementations I've ever seen. I wonder other distributions I don't know about have Mate in them. I can't wait to see it. So, oh, and one more thing. If there is a distribution you really want to see be installed, I will do those. So let me know what distribution you want to see me install. It has to be a sensible distribution. no hacking distributions. I'm not going to install those. So Kali Linux, no. Parrot Security OS, no. Tails, no. It has to be a sensible distribution that everyone can use. So for those who don't know, I've done Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, Debian, Devuan, and Slint. But there are many other distributions that I have not yet properly installed on this channel. So consider letting me know in the comments. And like I said, if you agree with some of the stuff that I've said about Marte not being deprecated, I want to know your opinion about Marte and whether Solus's decisions really justify it. So, thank you very much for watching.
Show stop recording button.
This is Jordan signing off, saying have a good day, everyone.